We honor John Warner today for his accomplishments, to be sure, but we honor him perhaps even more for who he is and the character he has demonstrated through a life of public service. Duty, integrity, independence, and honor in the truest sense of the word. Washington's values, Washington and Lee's values, Senator Warner's values. We thank him for his service to Washington and Lee, to the Commonwealth, to the United States, and the world. We are proud to call him one of our own. Senator Warner, please join me on stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is a very deeply moving moment in my life because, as I will try and, in a very few words, describe what it has meant to me, but I first want to tell a little story because it has a meaning. I was at a graduation ceremony where I was the speaker. That's one of the wonderful jobs that you have when you're in the Congress. And I've spoken literally, I think, at every college and university in our state and many others across our land. But as I walked down the aisle following the president, Mr. President, I had a sheaf of papers under my arm and a fellow with a mace, and we were going in pomp and circumstance. And you know, that great song, it's like you took a shot of whiskey early in the morning, you really get it all revved up. And suddenly a young graduate jumped up, and she had on her cap, and a beautiful lady, just look, you're the model of that lady, as a matter of fact. And she pressed into my hand a little note, and she said, "Read this." So during the course of the invocation, I read it, and it was really a magnificent touch of prose. And it was something that I've followed ever since in my life. It said, "Blessed are ye that are brief, for ye shall be re-invited." I want very much to come back to Washington and Lee, Dr. Jenks, and have my 70. But President Russo, as you spoke this morning earlier, and again here today, but most definitely this morning, I thought of Francis Pendleton Gaines, that marvelous man who instilled in me so much in the values of life. And you, sir, have his qualities. You don't have his baritone voice. You don't have quite that swagger, but you have the ability. I paced your remarks, and they kept absolute pace with your heart, because you spoke from your heart, and you spoke of your love for this university. And we thank you for your service, and you bring enormous, enormous respect to this distinguished institution. Thank you, sir. Now, Bo Dudley and I have known each other through the years. Bo's wife and my wife's right here. Jeannie, where is your wife? She's here. Why didn't you guys sit together? They're the best of friends. But as Bo will tell you, I was privileged to serve as a trustee of this great university with his father. And his father was first he was a very brilliant and intelligent young man. I say young because he left life, as did my father. We both lost our fathers in their early 60s. And he was gentle and humorous. And I think you, like me, Bo, felt that our fathers were so attached to this university that somehow we had to come back and to serve in their stead. And that you've done. And you have all the graces and all the intellect and all the wit of your great father. Good luck, my friend. Whenever I'm privileged to come to Washington and Lee, my first duty, if at all possible, it is the first thing I do, is to walk the colonnades. Because I then think that in 1899, my father entered Washington and Lee University, graduating in '03, and he strolled that very colonnade. And it reinstills in me the strength that he gave me and the strength that this university gave to me. You know, in the life of a senator, there are moments which are extremely painful. And fortunately, I only had 2 episodes in my 30 years. And Mr. President, I want to correct one thing. I am the second longest serving. The longest serving was old Governor, then Senator Harry Floodberg Byrd. Harry Byrd was 32 years and I was 30. But you think about certain things. I served with 261 individuals in the United States Senate, and it is a great privilege. The old senator told me one time when I first came, he said, "Young man, there'll be times you're called on to speak. Fear not, get up and grab the podium and look at them and pause in your breath for a moment, because there's only 100 of us that represent 300 million people. So they want to look at you. Then you start talking, and eventually you may think of something to say." But I want to tell this story. There's a reason for that, and I'll finish my last sentence of why I used the gavel to gavel you down. And I served with 261 of these wonderful people. And there comes a time in the Senate, under the rules, when all 100 must go into the chamber, close the doors, lock them, and there's no electronic, phones are disconnected, everything. And that's when we have to sit in judgment of a fellow senator who's transgressed either the law of the land or the ethics and standards of the United States Senate, and determine whether or not we, sitting in judgment, shall expel that individual. That only happened twice. And it's a very painful experience. And I remember I was sitting next to one colleague, and I could see the angst in his face, and I could feel the sorrow in the faces of all of them when we have to do these duties. And this man uttered, "Oh, there, but for the grace of God, go I." And I said to myself, I wouldn't have said that. There, for the grace of God, I will never go, because I am a graduate of Washington and Lee and the honor system. That system has given me enormous strength throughout my public life. And that was the only thing I thought, Dr. Russo, you talked about the culture of this university and its values. We must, many times, I've given speeches on this, studied the history of it, and it's an intangible that is so vital as these young people leave this great university and go out into this tumultuous world, a world that is so far more complicated and challenging and dangerous than the world that I entered in 1949 when I left this great university. Well, I want to tell one other story, and that is my first election to the United States Senate. It came about under tragic circumstances. I'd been in a primary against Linwood Holton, was one of the competitors in the primary, another state legislator, and a very fine man who was chairman of our party at that time, and he won, fair and square. 10,000 people gathered in Richmond for the, at that time, largest political convention ever held in the history of the United States with voting delegates. But that fellow, unfortunately, as we all do in this job that I've been in, flying a little plane late at night, and it came in, the tail hit the top of the tree and he lost his life, and the party turned to me. But I want to go to that first election. I had 10 weeks in which to put that election together. And I had a lot of good fortune, but it was a tough challenge in 10 weeks to try and win a Senate seat. But I want to talk about the last debate I had with my opponent. Describe my opponent. He was Attorney General. He's a very fine man. And since I was elected, we've become fast friends. And that's the way so much of our political system in this state has gained the admiration of states across the nation. We have a greater degree of bipartisanship in the Commonwealth of Virginia than other states, I'll tell you, across our nation. But anyway, the last debate, 6 days before the election, and it was in Alexandria, Virginia, historic Alexandria, Virginia, and every television set imaginable was there taking that debate in, because it was an interesting race and no pundit dared predict who was going to win that race. And I tell you, I won by 0.4% out of 1.7 million votes, how close it was. But what brings about that tiny fraction? A mistake at the last minute can cost you. I'm not saying that my opponent made a mistake, but he gave me a tremendous opening in that debate. Being the sitting Attorney General, he spoke last to address the crowd. And he stood up and he shook his finger at him. You should never do that as a politician. Always, like a preacher, wave your hands gracefully. But I know he took his finger and he pointed at him. And he said, "You should vote for me because I'm a native Virginian. I'm a native Virginian." And he sat down. And I got up and I said, "Okay, old boy, how do you top this?" Well, I got up and my mother was with me. She was about 86 years old and she was seated down in the front row of this debate. And I turned to my mother and I said, "Mother, give me the strength to reply to what my adversary has said. But I guess if you were here, you would say that I had nothing to do with where I was born. My father was a medical doctor. He graduated here as he went on. He was a school teacher. He lived with the doctor, and the doctor became so fond of him and took him on his appointments. He said one day, 'Go get your degree, John.' And he did, and he was a doctor. But my mother said to the audience, she in a microphone said, 'Well, if old Dr. John and I'd ever known that our little boy wanted to be a senator, I'd have crossed the Potomac River and had him under the trees.'" Well, you know, by this time, the audience was just, I had them, you know, I knew. So I needed to pitch that last ball across that plate and strike him out. And this is how I did it. I said, "My opponent, you're correct. I didn't have anything to do with where I was born. But you did have every faculty to make the decision that you made as to where you would go to get your degrees in college and higher education." And there was a silence in the room. And I said, "My opponent turned his back on 38 institutions of higher learning, and he went north to school to Princeton to get his degree." This man was sweating, he was absolutely dying. And then there was a silence. I said, "I chose my father's university. I went to General Washington's university. I went to General Lee's university. And that's why you will elect me United States Senator," and that they did. Now, you remember the story I opened with, the little note that was handed me? You wouldn't believe it. I'm walking in, and another note is handed me. And it's going to be framed in my memorabilia with that first note. It reads as follows. Note, when President finishes his remarks, he will give the podium to you. I got it. Everyone will want to hear from you. Thank you. You've been most responsive and heart-warming. But the program will have almost run its course when you talk, especially if it's nice weather. Folks will be ready to adjourn, so please forgive me in telling you to be very brief. Goodbye.